So what I want to do today is to continue some comments about the consequences of migration, broaden it into a discussion about ethnic minorities and as much as I can about their demography, and see what the future might hold for those populations. To reprise some of the comments made last time, migration has a number of demographic consequences, some positive and some negative. Obviously, it tends to increase the size of the populations of the area into which people are moving. It decreases the populations, other things be equal, of the populations from which they have moved. Sometimes it also affects death rates and birth rates, independently of that. Usually, in the last few centuries, death rates, the movement of people from one part of the world to another is often accompanied by warfare, sometimes warfare of an extremely violent and protracted kind. The invasions of the Mongols into China, which created the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century, is thought to have led to the loss over decades of about 50 million people from the population of China, which then may have been of the order of 200 million people, and to have shifted the entire center of gravity of the population of China from the north to the south for quite a long time. Likewise, in the New World, as I mentioned before, the arrival of Europeans in increasing numbers led to widespread destruction of the North and South American native populations, not so much by violence and warfare, although that happened, but much more through the introduction of diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis and other diseases for which those populations were completely unprepared, having been separated from the old world for many thousands of years. They had no natural immunity. It also has more subtle effects. Kingsley Davis pointed out in his seminal but neglected paper on the theory of change in response that migration is an alternative response to demographic pressures from death rates and birth rates, and that the effect of migration from a country where the population pressure is quite high, where fertility is quite high, may, for example, be to delay the onset of the fertility transition. This is perhaps most noted in the case of Ireland, where despite the fact that the birth rate remained well above replacement rate until well into the 20th century, until the mid-1950s, in fact, considerably higher than anywhere else in Europe, nonetheless, the population of Ireland declined from the 1840s to the 1950s to about a half of its previous level, because the level of emigration, about 1/3 of every person in each birth cohort emigrated from Ireland over that period, was greater than the very considerable natural increase. More modest and consequently population pressure was reduced, and it is widely believed what would have been an earlier demographic transition of fertility in Ireland was delayed by many, many decades. Something similar on a more modest scale is thought to have happened in Puerto Rico because of immigration to the US, and also possibly the emigration of Europeans from the western seaboard of Europe. Those 54 million that I mentioned last week is thought to have delayed the demographic transition, except crucially in France, where you'll recall the fertility transition took place about 100 years earlier than in the rest of Europe, and where uniquely among the major Western powers of Europe, there was almost no immigration from France, and also little possibility of migration from town to the countryside, because France's industrialization, despite its technical and scientific prowess, was much delayed. I also pointed out that on a much smaller scale, that migration is probably essential for the survival of very small populations to prevent them falling into very low population size with increasingly erratic sex ratio for purely statistical reasons, which may lead to their further reduction in birth rate and their eventual extinction. Simulations of a stochastic kind make this possibility quite clear. Migration balances out the numbers, prevents genetic drift, keeps up effective size, and preserves diversity. And of course, finally, it increases the cultural diversity of areas by the importation of new populations with new religions, new cultures, new languages, and new ways of life. The definition of ethnic groups, I'm sure, is something which you're well familiar with from other courses and other study, and I won't dwell on it. It's not a, a sharp definition, not a sharp criterion, but it tends to apply rather to groups of people sharing distinctive characteristics of a cultural kind, religion, language, sometimes with a biological background, sometimes distinguishable by appearance, what the Canadians call visible minorities in their ethnic classification, and sometimes not. Maybe indigenous, maybe arising out of migration, maybe arising out of conquest. In democracies nowadays, normally self-attributed. In autocratic societies where there is a case for, it is felt, for labeling ethnic minorities, normally as a way of keeping people in their place. Identity is enforced by law, as in the case of South Africa in times gone past. In democracies and free societies where there is a demand by ethnic groups for identity, this is done usually on an entirely voluntary basis. People say for themselves what ethnic group they belong to, if any. Interestingly enough, in recent American censuses, quite a few people have not filled in this, this question, and therefore depriving themselves, as it were, of an ethnic label. The demographic interest is primarily in case there are differences. If there are no differences in vital rates, no differences in birth rates, no differences in death rates, no differences in rates of migration in or out, so that the relative numbers remain static, the numbers are still interesting, but the demographic interest is rather muted. If demographic differences emerge in terms of rates of reproduction and rates of increase, rates of decline, then of course this means that the balance of numbers is changing, and particularly in democracies, the balance of power may be changing in that society and sometimes creating tensions. And quite a lot of the demographic interest is of this political kind at the present time. In the past, of course, we have very little information about what the different ethnic groups in diverse societies did in terms of their birth rates. We only have a rather tenuous grasp about what the birth rate and the death rate of the entire population was like. And it's not easy to get information about differences in birth rates for the pre-transitional, pre-democratic past. Occasionally there are glimmers of light. For example, the Ottoman Empire, which included a wide variety of different ethnic groups and religions, did have censuses, and from that it's possible from time to time to infer differences in the birth rate. And it turns out, for example, perhaps rather surprisingly, that the Christian subjects of the Sultan had a somewhat higher birth rate than the Turkish subjects of the Sultan in pre-transitional times in the 19th and 18th centuries. As these multicultural empires are dismembered by war or collapse from various internal regions, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, all terminated by the First World War, or as they implode for other reasons, like the Soviet Union in 1991, then, of course, what was a single political entity becomes fragmented into lots of smaller political entities, and in those entities there are often ethnic minorities. If those entities become democratic, then all sorts of things become salient and important, which previously perhaps had lesser importance. And when it is the case that numbers of people in different regions, which are often, of course, people of different ethnic groups, or when ethnic groups or religions are recognized explicitly in constitutions, then demographic differences start to become very important indeed. One example is out of the Lebanon. In the Lebanon, when it was formulated as a state after the First World War, initially under a French suzerainty, the constitution provided, as a result of the census of 1933, that the president of the Lebanon should be a Maronite Christian, that the prime minister should be a Sunni Muslim, and that the speaker of the House of what we would call House of Commons, the parliament, was a Shia Muslim. And that reflected the relative numbers of people as reflected by the census of 1933, which asked people what religion they belonged to, and it was thought to be a fair distribution of power. And that remains true to the present day, even though, of course, the present political structure of Lebanon is somewhat shambolic. No one has dared to hold a census since then in Lebanon, because almost certainly the positions would now be reversed. The birth rate of the Maronite Christians has been, for many decades, lower than either the other major groups in Lebanon. The birth rate of the Shia Muslims has been the highest, and those of the Sunni has been in the middle. They're all declining over time, but the rank order is quite clear. It is quite clear that this apportionment, this formal constitutional apportionment of power, according to numbers, would have to be completely reversed. That would undoubtedly lead to serious dissent and possibly make conflict in Lebanon, always just below the surface, very, very likely. Likewise, in Nigeria, there's a similar arrangement whereby the different regions of Nigeria are allotted seats in the federal parliament according to the numbers revealed by the census. That has made holding a rational, effective census in Nigeria nearly impossible. Each time that a revision is called for, the numbers jump up enormously beyond any possibility of demographic increase, because, of course, the region which has got the most numbers gets the most seats in the parliament. The region with the most seats in the parliament is able to award itself more federal funds for its support. This is very explicit at election time, very explicit also from time to time at census time. There are many other examples, but that's one of them. This notion of ethnic minorities does not just apply, of course, to one kind of group of persons with a common kind of origin. Following what I've been saying last time on Tuesday, it might follow that most ethnic minorities arise out of some migratory process. This is by no means the case. Ethnic minorities can be created by boundary changes. They can arise out of invasions, and there are a number of different categories of ethnic groupings, some minority, some majority, visible in the world in the past and in the present. In some cases, the original inhabitants are replaced or marginalized by migration. In northern Africa, the original populations of Christian origin were marginalized by the Arab invasions of the 7th century, for example. Likewise, in Anatolia by Turkish invasions. In North America, as I mentioned, the originally dominant indigenous populations were marginalized and greatly reduced in number by European invasions. In Australia, a similar fate befell the Aboriginals. And in England, the original population of Celtic origin and language and Christian religion was submerged in the 6th and 7th centuries culturally by Anglo-Saxon invasions, such that the remnant populations are only culturally apparent in Wales, in Cornwall, and in parts of Scotland. It used to be thought that the Celtic populations of Brittonic language and Christian religion were essentially exterminated by the Anglo-Saxon invaders. This was assumed because of the extraordinary pattern of the English language that we're speaking today. There are about 50,000 words in the English language, of which not more than 50 are of Celtic origin. It seemed a natural understanding from this that there had been a population wipeout, a complete ethnic cleansing, except in those marginal western areas. This is almost certainly not true. Demographic considerations, archaeological considerations, and above all, modern genetic considerations, which many of you will be very well familiar, suggest that quite the reverse is the case, that the greater part of the genetic ancestry of the populations of the British Isles are quite ancient, and that what has happened is a complete cultural makeover and not a population turnaround of the magnitude which the language patterns appear to suggest. So things, some evidence is contrary to the effects of other evidence. I list here also various other ways in which people can become minorities, sometimes dominant for a while, like the Manchus in China and the whites in South Africa, sometimes more complex. Quite often, deliberate attempts to create more apparently sustainable, more apparently viable nation states out of the fragmentation of empires have had unexpected but predictable negative results. This is a map of part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which existed until 1918, centered on Vienna, which is, you can't see it on the map, it must be there. Well, here's Bratislava, Vienna. Oh, there's Vienna, yes, the print is too small, I'm very sorry. This enormous area was carved up at the Treaty of Versailles by the victorious Allied powers, with politicians crawling over maps on the wall, drawing lines on it, saying, well, this is mostly Hungarian origin, that ought to be Hungarian, this is mostly Romanian origin, that ought to be Romania, and so on, trying to create democratic nation states in a rather naive hope that this would produce lasting peace. Well, certainly the enormous diversity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was greatly reduced by the fragmentation of its constituent parts into notionally democratic national entities. But it created more ethnic minority problems. It didn't solve them all. For example, here in what is now Romania, part of which at that time was under Ottoman suzerainty, which of course disappeared. The northern part was heavily populated by ethnic Germans and by Hungarians in Transylvania up here. That's why it's kind of green in this map. The whole of this part of what is now Romania was transferred from Hungary, to which it used to belong, to the new state of Romania. In doing so, it exchanged a Romanian minority in Greater Hungary for a Hungarian minority in, as it were, Greater Romania, plus an ethnic German minority also in the same area. That's one example of the way in which this attempt to create more homogeneous states, in fact, failed to do so and created lasting problems of tension, which are still in existence in Romania, although most of the ethnic Germans have now moved back to Germany and, as it were, solved the problem. Another example was in Czechoslovakia. This is the country of Czechoslovakia, which the Versailles and Trianon map makers created out of the remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The blue bits are where the Czechs lived. In the far western part of Czechoslovakia is the Sudetenland, populated by people of German German ancestry, German ethnicity, one might say. Those of you who recall your history of the Second World War will recall that there was tremendous agitation by the Nazi-inspired leaders of the Sudetenland to join the German Reich under Hitler in 1933. And eventually, under German pressure, succeeded in doing so, thereby making Czechoslovakia defenseless, because all the mountainous areas with all the frontier fortresses was here, and that led to the easy invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938, which precipitated the invasion of Poland in the year that followed the Second World War. So major problems of ethnic consciousness, ethnic division, were created by the invention of these new states, which were hoped to be more ethnically homogeneous. And eventually, as you'll also recall, Czechoslovakia divided itself in the so-called Velvet Divorce of 1991 between the Czech part here and the Slovak part here, which could have been predicted at the time, I'd have thought. Lots of examples of that. Here's another example of the sort of ethnic mess. Here's the Balkans with Bosnia and Herzegovina, where, of course, the terrible conflicts took place between Serbs, Croats, and Muslim Bosnians in the 1990s, leading to tremendous refugee movements into Germany, creating new minorities there, of course. And here in Serbia, we have the province of Kosovo. Kosovo used to be populated mostly by Serbs. It's the site of one of their iconic military events, the Battle I forgot what it's called, terrible defeat in about 1346, where essentially the Turks took over this part of Serbia and eventually the whole lot. Over the course of time, the higher birth rate of the Kosovars, who are mostly Muslim, of Albanian ethnic group, replaced numerically or displaced numerically the Serbian population and provoked a violent and oppressive reaction by the Serbs, which was met, as you know, by air strikes by NATO in the 1990s, and eventually the creation of Kosovo as a separate independent state under UN supervision just a few years ago. Whether that will be viable or not, I don't know. But that's a quite interesting example of a state which detached itself, or became detached, became alienated from its, as it were, its parent, because of long-term differences in birth rate, which became salient once states began to have democratic ideals and numbers started to get translated into power. Sometimes it seems to be the case that even oppressive dictatorships, as the Ottoman Empire was, can keep highly mixed up populations of different ethnic origins in order, even by violent means, which then, once the overriding power is removed, they start to seek for a national state of their own, with endless conflicts over borders and minorities of the kind which I've just been describing. I also mentioned another way in which ethnic minorities can be created by arbitrary sudden changes in boundaries caused by the collapse of large empires. This is the case of the Soviet Union. In 1991, when the Soviet Union decided to abolish itself, there were, as I mentioned, 24 million people of so-called Russian nationality living in the republics of the Soviet Union outside the Russian Federation. And here they are. This is a map of them as in 1994, three years after the separation. Here is Russia proper. Here is what the Russians call the near abroad. Those republics of the former Soviet Union which adjoin the Russian Federation. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and so on. All of them had Russian populations in them, indicated in red, mostly in Kazakhstan, but also in Kyrgyzstan and the other Central Asian states. And these are now in a rather problematic position. Some have stayed, some have left. And their birth rates have been typically smaller or lower than those of the native population, than the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz. But that's not the major issue. The major issue is one of politics and power and the extent to which they are expected to integrate by learning Kazakh and becoming, as it were, Kazakhs and ceasing to be Russians. Very difficult and yet unsolved political problem. Within the Russian Federation itself, there is enormous ethnic diversity, even though the Russian Federation or Russia has divested itself of its ethnic hinterland, all these peripheral republics. There is still tremendous variation within Russia itself. This is a map of the crude birth rate by geographical region in Russia. Over here is Moscow I can't read it. Moscow must be about here. St. Petersburg will be up here. And you can see how much of Russia there is to the east of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which to us seems to be quite a long way east already. The populations here are, of course, very sparsely spread. These are huge areas with quite sparse populations. And nonetheless, they are not mostly Russian. The ethnic Russian population is mostly in the western part here and decreases in numbers as we go further to the east. The populations down here are very predominantly of Muslim and religion and Turkic language and ethnic origin. Over here, they're mostly of Mongolian ethnic origin and not ethnic Russian. Population size small, even though area huge. And one of the concerns which the Russian Federation has, which was even more potent in Soviet times, for obvious reasons, was that the birth rate is differential. That here we have the lowest birth rate, this is just a crude birth rate, it's between 6 and 7 in these green areas, which are mostly Russian Slavic populations speaking the Russian language, of Orthodox religion, if any religion at all. The yellow areas are about crude birth rate of about 8, and the red areas are crude birth rate of about 12, particularly as you see in the Muslim Turkic areas, including Chechnya and the other trouble spots which erupt into our news headlines from time to time. And so the balance is changing even in the Russian Federation, although less fast than it was in the Soviet Union before 1991. And here's a final example of population change as a result of a combination of immigration plus considerably different birth rates. Here are the counties of the United States from the US census of, this is 2000, yeah, the year 2000. showing the proportion of the residents in different counties identifying as Hispanic. And as you see, that the dark green is from 61 to 100%. Well, none are 100%. But that's a majority Hispanic is dark green, and getting on for majority Hispanic is the mid green. And these areas are increasing in frequency, the dark green ones, as it were, all the time, because of the migration of many hundreds of thousands of people from Latin America every year into the US, plus, of course, the quite considerable TFR differences. The Hispanic TFR in the US is about 2.95, that of the non-Hispanic white population about 1.85, that of other minorities usually quite low, Asians lower than European people of European origin, for example. So all sorts of change happening there, of which more in a moment. Why do minorities often have, not always, often have different demographic characteristics? This is an unsolved problem. It's a kind of subset, if you like, of demographic transition theory, but a rather messy one and a complication to it. It used to be thought, particularly by sociologists, that the main, if not the only reasons why one observed differences in birth rates and death rates between and marriage characteristics between different ethnic groups was because of their different socioeconomic status, because of their socioeconomic characteristics. That's the so-called characteristics hypothesis, that because certainly most ethnic groups of immigrant origin tended to come from poorer countries, in the 20th century anyway, almost by definition. They occupied a lower place in the labour market, their income levels were lower, their education levels were lower, and this, in the nature of things, as you would expect in any kind of demographic transition theory, led to higher birth rates, which would diminish in time as those populations, if they were allowed to, if discrimination and other handicaps didn't prevent them from doing so, they would move up the social hierarchy, acquire the same kind of characteristics as the majority population. That being the case, the ethnic differentials in fertility and the death rate would disappear, and you have a much more homogeneous population at the end of the day from the point of view of demographic behavior. That clearly hasn't happened. And a number of other modifications to those notions, which are more specific to the minority situation, have been developed. The most notable being the so-called minority status hypothesis, which is a confusing one because it operates in two different directions at once. One way of interpreting, of thinking about minority status is that if ethnic minority groups recognize the handicaps which they face, the hostility which they may face in the majority population, the lower social prestige which they may enjoy, the handicap to their social promotion which their high birth rates may generate, then they may, realizing these handicaps, take steps to moderate them and reduce them. And the obvious example of that is the remarkable behavior of Jews who moved into the United States and into Western Europe after the pogroms in Russia in the 1880s onwards, in quite large numbers. Many of them came from small rural towns, were badly educated, had high birth rates, and were regarded as being highly alien and undesirable by certainly in Western Europe and to some extent in the US as well. An impoverished population regarded as a problem. Within a very short space of time, their demographic transition had accelerated and had overtaken the demographic transition which is going on at the same time among the majority population in Western Europe and the US at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So that Jewish fertility, for the most part, in these areas has since then and up to the present day been lower than that of the average. Partly for that, and of course partly for many other reasons, Jewish social status has improved. The Jewish occupational status is higher than average, typically in Western countries. Income levels are higher than average. Educational levels are often very much higher than average. But the numbers are declining relative to the majority as a consequence. This causes concern in Jewish populations, in Jewish organizations, both in the Western Europe and in the US, as Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said in a book of his, which is entitled "Shall We Have Grandchildren?" Jewish numbers are declining in most populations, partly because the birth rate is so low, partly because of assimilation, of people drifting out of the Jewish category, being perhaps having some vestigial Jewish identity, but not identifying themselves as Jewish to synagogue authorities, not taking part in Jewish rituals, and therefore being lost, as it were, to the population, at least from the point of view of statistics, if not from the point of view of some kind of residual consciousness. There are other examples of that, but the Jewish example is perhaps the obvious one. Another manifestation of minority status is exactly the opposite. That individuals, populations rather, will protect their minority status by emphasizing their demographic differences, particularly their high birth rate, and particularly the rule against outmarriage. One example of this, I suppose, familiar to all demographers, are the Hutterites. The Hutterites are a minority which has preserved their minority status by geographical segregation, by the insistence that those who marry out of the group will leave the group, by powerful pressures to prevent people doing that if possible, or that they are given a year of freedom, as you know, in youth, to try the outside world and see if they can they want it or if they can stand it. And that's called by some sociologists defensive structuring, that patterns of behavior develop in society which tend to preserve the culture, preserve the language, keep out outsiders, not necessarily in a hostile way, but just keep them at arm's length. Another example, curiously enough, comes from the Jewish population itself, from the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are notable in places like Stamford Hill in London, and who are numerous and increasing in number in Israel itself. Where the notion of a strict segregation of roles in the sexes is preserved, as it is in the Hutterites and one or two other similar groups, where contraception is not practiced, where birth rates are very high, and where interaction with other members of the population is kept at an absolute minimum. Consequently, the numbers increase rapidly, and this is thought to be one reason why the birth rate of Jews as a whole in the UK is actually going up, and also why the birth rate of Jews in Israel unusually is going up, because the numbers of the Haredim, especially in a very hygienic environment like Britain or Israel, are not kept in check by any kind of high mortality, or quite the contrary, and numbers are growing quite fast. And this causes some concern in Jewish Israel, because, of course, under the way in which the Jewish constitution or the Jewish politics works in Israel, the Likud religious party has particular privileges which enable large numbers of the Haredim in Israel to remain out of the workforce until about age 40, studying rather than working, and their wives earn the money and surviving on very generous government handouts, which increase with family size as a kind of family policy. So quite an interesting, complex little problem there, which one of the human scientists finalists last year wrote a very excellent thesis about. So all sorts of reasons why there are ethnic minority differences, some of which may persist and some of which may not persist. Which in the 20th century have really become salient because of the rise of democracy, because of the rise of human rights, because of the consciousness which arose for reasons beyond my capacity to explain in the 19th century of much more interest in ethnic identity, in old languages, in old customs, and so on, which led a large number of intellectuals to research the various rather submerged ethnic differences which still existed in their country, and try and revive them, and try and take an interest in the Finnish language, in Swedish Finland, in Welsh, in Gaelic, in Breton, Provençal, in France, even sometimes in the 20th century, as it were, raising languages Dracula-like from the dead by huge infusions of public money. the last person to speak Cornish died about 1850, if I recall correctly. Nonetheless, Cornish is now alive and well. Street names are being renamed in Cornish. This is only possible through government recognition of minority rights, even if they've had to be recreated from the grave, and the infusion of public money into supporting it. And you will see that in the proliferation of Welsh road signs throughout Wales, and the fact that Wrexham has now designated itself to be the first bilingual town in England. All sorts of patterns of this kind still continue. What this has led to is a great interest in ethnic categorization. That people who are conscious of belonging to ethnic minority groups of various kinds, whether of immigrant origin or of domestic indigenous origin, require to be labelled as that, partly for reasons of preserving a group identity, partly for reasons of trying to ensure that they have an appropriate slice of the cake, and particularly if they regard themselves as being disadvantaged, they and governments feel that those populations have to be identified in order that they can be targeted with appropriate funds and protected from discrimination. Consequently, an enormous expansion of questions about ethnic minority status or ethnic status. Routine now to ask people what their ethnic group is for almost anything which happens in this country. You would have had to have answered questions about your self-described ethnic identity when you applied to join the university, I believe. If you apply for an ESRC grant, you will be asked to identify yourself as according to ethnic group and possibly even religion. In some local authorities, if you wish to have planning permission to erect a garden shed, you have to state what ethnic group you belong to. These are the categorizations of the England 2011 census. I don't know if you can read the labels. There are at least 3 questions which relate to identity. One, the ethnic group question, which has various subdivisions here: white, the English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish, British, or Irish, Gypsy, Irish traveller, etc. Black, white, mixed, white and black Caribbean, and so on. Asian, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Chinese, African, Caribbean, other black, and other ethnic group, Arab, and so on. Religion, all sorts of religions. Any other religion, write in. You will all be well aware of the way in which some people take this for a ride. There were, I think, 300,000 Jedi Knights in the 2001 census. A new, rather vague question about how you describe your national identity. You can write in anything you like in that box there, and also asking about birthplace. Not citizenship, curiously enough. Similar sorts of things in the US. I'm sorry, this reproduced very badly. It probably isn't very legible. The United States has 3, or had 3, in fact 4 if you include birthplace, 3 completely separate systems of ethnic categorization, a consequence of different kinds of political pressures emanating from different kinds of self-identified groups, which the political system had somehow to accommodate, even though it makes the demographic data very messy. First of all, you've got the traditional race question. No, sorry, that's down here. First of all, you've got a question on Hispanic origin. People are invited to say whether they are or are not of Hispanic origin. If they are, then whether they're Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, or other. Then they're asked what their race is. Race is an acceptable category in the US. It's been asked in the census for a very, very long time. And it is independent of Hispanic origin. A person of Hispanic origin can be of any race, including a North American Indian, but that is perhaps rather unusual. But the person's race here is asked to be white, black, African American, or Negro, American. Interesting how terms go in and out of fashion and acceptability. American Indian or Alaskan Native, and write down which one. Filipino, Asian Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and so forth, or any other race. And it's possible here also to put down what your ancestry is. And it's also possible in 2000 census to write down more than one ancestry. And ancestry became so popular that there were people putting down 2, 3, 4 different ancestries, reflecting correctly their perception about their parentage and grandparentage. And all of these are independent. And so the nightmare which the Bureau of the Census has in formulating population distributions and especially population projections can only be imagined. This one was actually dropped in the year 2010 to the considerable consternation of some of the ethnic groups, because it meant that people who came from the Middle East, who regard themselves as Arab, really had a choice in terms of race between calling themselves white and calling themselves black. None of these ones would apply at all. And a lot of them objected to the notion of trying to call themselves white because it did not differentiate themselves sufficiently from the rest of the population. They felt that as Arabs, as people from the Middle East or people from North Africa, who also were, as it were, expected to call themselves white, that in fact they weren't treated as white by the rest of the population. They suffered from disadvantages of various kinds, which ought to be recognized in the census by enabling them to answer this question. But that wasn't asked. So it's very interesting that these questions are, which are all self-described, you understand, are often strongly supported by the groups which are thereby identified and are not an imposition on them, although some regard them as an imposition, others regard themselves as being very antithetical to national identity. In France, for example, all this would be completely illegal. The French Constitution, emphasizing citizenship and the unity of citizenship, however, not quite corresponding to reality, that assumption of equality might be, nonetheless takes a very strong stand against identification on religious or ethnic or racial grounds, feeling this is a complete contradiction of the French Constitution, which emphasizes the equality of citizens, which point of view which perhaps one can have some sympathy. So this pattern is very typical of the Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, America, United States, I mean, UK, much less on the continent, where register-based data are based upon parental citizenship and birthplace alone, and ethnic groups only appear in a few censuses, particularly those of Russia and elsewhere. What actually happens to ethnic data? These are some data showing the total fertility rate of ethnic minorities in the UK, constructed very laboriously by the so-called own child method, because data on categorization by ethnic group is not requested on the registration of birth, so it's got to be done by an indirect method. As you see, from 1979 onwards, the TFR of all groups has been going down. The yellow is Bangladeshi, this is Pakistani, and you can see that in the 1970s, 1980s, the TFR of those groups in the UK was rather like what it was in Pakistan and Bangladesh. That is to say 5 or 6, very much higher than that of the national average. The national average is this heavy line here. The Indian population, much lower to begin with, dropping down just below the national average. The African population is this one here, somewhat above, maintained probably by very considerable increases in the African population from high fertility African countries like Somalia, where the TFR of Somalis in Britain is about 5. But that of other Africans in Britain is much lower. The Chinese population, much lower. Typically, Chinese immigrants into Europe adopt very low fertility patterns, possibly following what Kerry Peach would call a Jewish road to social mobility. And they are indeed a very successful group. So very important to realize that by no means all ethnic minority populations have got higher birth rates than the native population. This is not true in a number of cases, and in other cases the difference is not all that great. This is just a model of the Chinese TFR in the UK, showing an asymptote of about 1.3. That is to say that it looks like it's stabilizing at about 1.3. This may change. Part of that's due to postponement. And when the postponement comes to an end, it'll go up again, as in other populations which postpone fertility. Here are some US data. Some of these go back to 1960. This graph goes from 1960 to 2000. The yellow line is the whole population of the US. The Non-Hispanic white population is this one here, about 1.85 compared with an average of about 2.1, which is the overall American level. That 2.1 moved up from 1.85 very much by the large and growing population of Hispanic people, where the TFR is about 2.95, and not changing very much, as you can see. The black population, of course, not of recent immigrant origin at all, has shown some convergence down to the national average. It's not distinguishable in the year 2000. So some trends to convergence, other patterns so far, not very much convergence at all. That depends quite a lot upon the balance of migration compared with the number of people of the same ethnic origin born in the country which we're concerned with. You can see here from these data, which go back to the 1970s, a consistent difference between the TFR of Pakistanis according to whether they are born in the UK or born in Pakistan itself. The open bars here are the TFRs of Pakistani women who were born sorry. The phrasing is bad. These are women who are born in Pakistan, residing in the UK. And as you can see, the white bars have the highest TFR. The pale grey bars are people of Pakistani origin born in the UK. And you can see that in each case that there's a difference. Those born in the UK have consistently, in some cases, much lower birth rates than those born in Pakistan, as you would imagine. But it's an illustration of the kind of assimilation, at least to local levels of fertility, which can be seen there. Even so, in the latest data here, which are not up to date, the UK-born Pakistani population still has a TFR of about 2.6, which is a lot higher than the national average. In the Indian case, the TFR has gone down much more, and that has already started to make that ethnic population age. Ethnic populations are by no means always youthful, like this Pakistani population is in the 2001 census. The Indian population shows marked signs of population aging, as you would expect, given the reduction in their TFR. Elsewhere, all sorts of changes are afoot. Persistent differences in birth rates and also in migration, leading to the diminution of the proportion of population of some groups and the increase in the proportion of others. Here in New Zealand, the people of European origin, the top dark blue line, are obviously heading downwards. Curiously, the population of Maori origin not, partly because Maori origin is a very fluid definition. A lot of people in New Zealand have part Maori, part European origin, and the numbers who report themselves as being Maori changes somewhat from time to time, depending upon the mood of the time, as it were. Ethnic change in the US, as projected by the US Census Bureau, is quite dramatic. The blue line here, the thin one going up sharply, is the Hispanic population. The red line at the top is the white non-Hispanic population, and you can see that the two are heading towards convergence, admittedly at the very long range of the end of the century. But the US Bureau of the Census projects that the US white non-Hispanic population will become an overall minority in the US by about 2042. And no one seems to be disputing this. It's almost carved in stone now. Almost nothing can stop that happening. Very interesting new development. And something similar, as I mentioned on Tuesday, is happening in European countries as well. These are defined on a registration basis on the whole, not an ethnic basis, by registration data in various countries which collect this information: the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and so on. I will skip that. It has been suggested, therefore, that we're now in the middle of a sort of third demographic transition. The first demographic transition, whereby birth and death rates move from a high position with low population growth via a position of population growth to a new balance where birth and death rates are both low and natural increase is moderate. To the second transition, of which you've all heard, this revolution in family and living arrangements and sexual behavior, births outside marriage and so on, and possibly a third transition where the population composition itself is altered by the process of international migration and differential rates of reproduction. That may all alter and be vitiated by much more interesting developments to do with love and sex, to do particularly with love and sex between ethnic groups, with the production of children of mixed ancestry who may be happy to consider themselves to be of mixed ancestry and who identify themselves as being of mixed ancestry voluntarily in questions of the census in this country and in the US and elsewhere. 660,000 in all in the census of 2001. Leading to what Jones, the great geneticist, has described as a brown future. Here are three very prominent people of mixed origin. The person on the top left you may recognize. Lewis Hamilton is the person down below, Britain's champion motor racing driver, and this young lady here was also of mixed origin, was a candidate for Miss France, who was dismissed from her status for some minor peccadillo, and one can only hope she might seek asylum from the beastly French in England, where I'm sure she'd be very welcome. These are unions outside one's own group recorded in the labour force survey in Great Britain. Not bang up to date, it's not more than 10 years ago, but the pattern is much the same now. What we've got here is a percent of people belonging to various different ethnic groups who are in unions, marital or otherwise, outside their own ethnic group. And you can see among the black Caribbean population, among men are on the right and women on the left. The proportion is up to 35%, more among men than among women. High proportions among black Africans, much lower among Indians, much lower among Pakistanis, and especially Bangladeshis, hardly any ethnic intermarriage there. A very interesting reversal among Chinese, where a higher proportion of Chinese women are in unions with non-Chinese men than is the case with Chinese men in respect of non-Chinese women. This looks wrong, but it's repeated over and over again in all the surveys which have been made, and it is clearly a reality, and it's, as you see, at a very high proportion indeed. And this means, of course, that populations of ethnic origin are becoming increasingly themselves mixed. This is the perhaps this is the more intelligible graph. This is the population of Caribbean origin, some level of Caribbean origin in England and Wales 2001, by age, 0 to 4, 10 to 14, and so on. The dark bar is a population of Caribbean origin, of wholly Caribbean origin. The pale bar is the population of Caribbean origin of mixed Caribbean origin, usually mixed Caribbean and white. And as you can see, as time is going on, the mixed part of the Caribbean origin population is becoming predominant over the other. That has led to the supposition that in due course, the process of ethnic intermarriage, fast with some groups, slow with others, will lead to populations of mixed origin becoming, as it were, the most important ethnic group numerically. This is a very long-range stochastic projection made by Sergei Sherlov, showing in this thin orange line the rise of the population of mixed ethnic origin on very conservative assumptions over the next 100 years. Very long range, awful lot can happen in 100 years. But these are very conservative assumptions, and it may well be much higher than that, and probably will be. So the question arises, is this something which will affect the whole world? Is the whole world going to become as mixed as it looks as though Western populations in the developed world are going to do? Probably not. Partly because some of them are too big for that to happen. It's not possible for the populations of India and China, which are in any case already mixed, especially in the case of India, to become mixed through immigration, because there aren't enough immigrants in the world, and not remotely possible an imaginable level of immigration which would make in India as mixed by immigration as UK or Germany or the United States is being. So far, the patterns of diversity from immigration in countries of the third world are quite modest. Many of them, of course, are already diverse because of their inclusion of a large number of traditional native persons of different origin. That's different. But the prospect of most of third world countries becoming as diverse as Western Europe has done seems to be rather small. for the foreseeable future. We may have all sorts of interesting connotations from the point of view of international relations, power relations, and the perception of what national interest actually means in the West, which is more diverse, compared with the rest of the world, which must remain less diverse, especially in the bigger countries. So on that contentious political point, I will stop. Thank you very much.